The world had become a very quiet and lonely place for Clara Bellamy. Once, her life had been filled with the rustle of fine silk dresses and the murmur of polite conversation in a grand house. But that was before her father's business collapsed. After he was gone, the grand house was sold, and the so-called friends vanished like smoke. Clara was left with nothing but a heavy silence and the cold stares of people who believed misfortune was contagious. She spent her days searching for work, any work. But doors seemed to close before she could even raise her hand to knock. One afternoon, while looking through a newspaper for any opportunity, a small, stark advertisement caught her eye. It was from a man named Elias Blackwood in a place called Sweetwater, Montana. He was seeking a wife. The words were plain and honest. They promised a life of certain hardship and no luxury. The only thing offered was simple companionship. To everyone else, it might have seemed a desperate offer. But to Clara, it felt like a lifeline. It asked for nothing she felt she could not give. She had no expectations of joy or love left in her heart. She only wanted a place where she would not be judged, a place where she could be quiet and useful. She wrote a simple letter in reply. She did not pretend to be anything she was not. Weeks later, an envelope arrived. Inside was a single train ticket west. That was all. No demands, no instructions. Clara packed her one small carpet bag with her few remaining belongings. She did not look back as she boarded the train. The further the train traveled from the city, the more the world outside changed. The crowded buildings and smoky air gave way to rolling hills, which then flattened into vast, endless plains. The sky seemed to grow bigger. She watched it all pass by, her heart feeling like a stone in her chest. She was not hoping for a better life. She was only going to meet it. She expected nothing from the man named Elias, and she believed he would expect nothing from her in return. That at least felt like a fair arrangement. The shriek of the train whistle was a sharp sound that pulled Clara from her thoughts. The conductor's call of Sweetwater echoed through the car. She smoothed the wrinkles from her simple dress, took a steadying breath, and picked up her single carpet bag. Stepping onto the platform, the first thing she noticed was the air. It was clean and dry, carrying the faint scent of dust and pine, so different from the sooty dampness of the city. Her eyes scanned the nearly empty platform and found him immediately. A man stood leaning against a post, his posture relaxed but tall. He was not the elderly, worn-down soul she had pictured. He was younger, with broad shoulders and a quiet strength in his stance. As she approached, he pushed himself upright and removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His face was kind, etched with lines from the sun, not from age. His eyes were a calm, steady blue. "Miss Bellamy," he said. His voice was a low, gentle rumble. "I am Elias Blackwood." "Welcome to Montana." He did not smile broadly, but his gaze was respectful and curious. He took her bag and led her to a simple wooden wagon, hitched to two patient-looking horses. He helped her up to the seat before climbing up himself. The wagon rolled away from the tiny station, and a deep silence settled between them. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but a vast and spacious one, filled with the creak of the wagon and the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. Clara looked out at the land. It was huge and empty and beautiful in a wild, untamed way. She could see the truth of his advertisement in every mile. This was a place of hardship. When the cabin came into view, it was exactly as she had imagined from his letter. It was small and sturdy, built of logs with a simple chimney. It looked lonely sitting there on the great expanse of prairie, but it also looked solid. He helped her down from the wagon and led her inside. The main room was clean and orderly, with a stone fireplace and simple furniture. He showed her to a small door off the main room. "This will be your room," he said, opening it. Inside was a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window looking out toward the distant mountains. "It is yours for as long as you want it to be." The words were simple, but their meaning was immense. He was giving her a space that was truly her own. He was not assuming anything. He made no list of rules, no demands about meals or chores. He simply offered her a place. Clara stood in the doorway, her carefully built walls of reserve suddenly feeling very thin. This quiet man with the calm eyes was not what she had expected at all. The first light of dawn was a pale gray streak on the horizon when Clara heard the soft creak of the cabin's main door and the quiet footsteps of Elias heading out to begin his day. This was the rhythm of the ranch, a rhythm that began long before the sun properly rose. Clara would lie in her narrow bed, listening to the distant, comforting sounds of his morning chores. The low murmur of his voice as he spoke to his horses, the clang of a milk pail, the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood for the stove. These sounds were her new clock, marking a day that was entirely her own to fill. For the first few days, she moved through the small cabin like a ghost, careful not to disturb anything. She would tidy her own room meticulously, fold her few clothes, and stare out the window at the immense sky. Elias had meant what he said. He expected nothing from her. He would return for the midday meal, which he called dinner, and he would simple food for them both, bread and cheese or a bit of cold meat, never commenting on her lack of contribution. This freedom, which she had thought she wanted, began to feel strangely heavy. It was a vast empty space, and she felt herself adrift in it. She was not used to having her time be her own. In her old life, every minute had been scheduled, filled with social calls and obligations designed to maintain a certain appearance. Here there was no one to appear for. There was only the quiet cabin and the endless land. The change began slowly, almost without her realizing it. One morning after Elias had left, she looked at the cold ashes in the fireplace from the night before. It was a simple, practical task. She found the kindling and the matches, and after a few tries, she managed to coax a small, warm flame to life. She did it not because she had to, but because the thought of Elias coming in from the cold to a dark, chilly room felt suddenly wrong. She felt a small, unexpected flicker of satisfaction as the fire caught and began to crackle. The next day, she looked at the cast-iron stove. Elias had left a pot of coffee warming on it for her, a simple kindness she had come to expect. She decided to try and repay it. She found a sack of flour, a crock of lard, and a jar of salt. She remembered watching the cook in her father's house make biscuits. Her first attempt was a disaster. The dough was too sticky, then too dry. The resulting biscuits were small, hard, and burnt on the bottom. When Elias came in, he saw the sad little lumps on a plate. He did not laugh or frown. He picked one up, tapped it on the table, and smiled a little. "Well now," he said in his calm voice, "I reckon the chickens will be mighty pleased with these. They do enjoy a crunchy treat," and he was right. He crumbled them up later and tossed them into the yard, and the chickens pecked at them eagerly. He had turned her failure into a success for someone else. Encouraged by his quiet acceptance, Clara tried again. Her next batch of bread was only slightly less hard. Elias ate it without comment, dipping it in his stew to soften it. Her third attempt, however, produced a loaf that was actually edible. It was lopsided and a little pale, but it was soft and tasted like bread. That evening, she saw him take a second piece, slathering it with butter. He did not say, "This is good bread," but the action was a louder praise than any words could have been. He had shown her he appreciated it by simply enjoying it. She began to explore the land around the cabin more boldly. She found a patch of earth near the back door that caught the afternoon sun. It was overgrown with weeds, but the soil looked dark and rich. She spent an entire day on her hands and knees, pulling up the stubborn roots and turning the earth. She did not ask Elias for help or permission. She simply did it. She found a few seed packets in the kitchen, left over from some previous year, and she planted them in neat, careful rows. Every morning after Elias left, she would go out to check her garden, watering the tiny plot with a bucket from the well. It was a tiny claim she was staking, not on the land, but on her own place within this life. One evening, as they sat in the comfortable silence after supper, Clara was mending a tear in her apron. She let out a small, unconscious sigh. "I do miss having a book to read in the evenings," she said softly. It was not a complaint, merely a thought spoken aloud. She had not expected any response. Elias simply nodded, his gaze on the fire. 2 days later, he hitched the wagon to go into town for supplies, a trip he made only once a month. He was gone for most of the day. When he returned, he unloaded sacks of flour and sugar, a new hammer, and other practical items. Then he walked over to where Clara was stirring a pot of soup on the stove. He held out a small paper-wrapped parcel. "Saw this at the general store," he said, his tone casual as if it were of no importance. "Thought you might have a use for it." Puzzled, Clara wiped her hands on her apron and took the package. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a book. It was not new. Its green cloth cover was faded and worn, its spine cracked with use. The title, stamped in gold letters that were almost completely rubbed away, was "Leaves of Grass" by Walt Whitman. She looked up at Elias, her eyes wide with disbelief. Books were a luxury, a precious thing out here. "You traded for this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shifted his weight slightly, looking almost embarrassed. "Fella there wasn't much of a reader. Seemed a fair trade for a bag of coffee." He said it so simply, as if he had traded for a new horseshoe nail and not a treasure. He had given up something he needed, something valuable, for something he knew would bring her a moment of happiness. He asked for nothing in return. Not thanks, not recognition. Clara held the book to her chest, the weight of it solid and real in her hands. She looked at this quiet man who mended fences and gentled horses, who accepted her burnt bread and noticed her silent wishes. A feeling she had long forgotten began to warm the cold, stone-like place inside her chest. It was not anything grand or dramatic. It was a small, gentle thaw, like the first soft melt of a winter frost under a kind spring sun. The wall around, her heart built so carefully to keep out disappointment, did not break, but a single small brick right in the center quietly crumbled into dust. The comfortable silence that had grown between Clara and Elias began to change. It was no longer just an empty space. It became a room they shared, and slowly they began to fill it with words. The long evenings lit by the soft glow of the kerosene lamp and the crackling fire became their time. The vast quiet of the prairie outside seemed to encourage confidences, making their small circle of light feel like the only place in the world. It started one night after a supper of stew and Clara's steadily improving bread. The wind howled outside, a lonely sound that made the cabin feel all the more cozy. Elias was carefully oiling a leather harness, his work-roughened hands moving with a practiced ease. Clara sat in her usual chair, the poetry book he had given her open in her lap. She was not reading it. She was watching the firelight play on his thoughtful face. "You never ask about my life before," she said quietly. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. He looked up, his blue eyes calm and attentive. He set the harness down, giving her his full focus without saying a word. That silent attention was a permission she had never received from anyone. And so she told him. The words came slowly at first, then in a quiet rush. She spoke of the grand cold house that was like a beautiful cage. She described the suffocating expectations, the constant pressure to be nothing more than a pretty decoration on her father's arm. She told him about the terrible day everything was lost, the whispers and the turned backs that followed. She spoke of the profound loneliness that came from being judged worthless because her family's money was gone. She did not cry. She had shed all those tears long ago. She simply laid the facts of her old life before him like a story she had read about someone else. Elias listened. He did not interrupt, nor did he offer the empty, sympathetic sound she had learned to despise. He simply absorbed her story, his gaze never leaving her face. When she finished, the only sound was the pop of the fire. He looked into the flames for a long moment, collecting his thoughts. "I am sorry for your pain," he said finally, his voice low and sincere. "But I am not sorry for the path that brought you here." He picked up the harness again, not as a dismissal, but as something to do with his hands while he spoke his own truth. "This land," he began, "it don't care about your name or your past. It only cares about what you do. It can be cruel. A blizzard can wipe out a herd you spent years building. A drought can burn up a field of hay in a week." He spoke, not with bitterness, but with a deep, abiding respect for something powerful and unpredictable. "But it can be beautiful, too," he continued, a softer note entering his voice. "The way the light hits the mountains in the morning, the smell of the sage after a rain, the trust of an animal you've gentled with patience." He told her then about his own journey, coming west with little more than a dream and a strong back. He spoke of the back-breaking work of building the cabin, of learning from his mistakes, of the solitude that could either break a person or make them strong. "A person's value," Elias said, looking directly at her, his words simple and clear as water. "It ain't in their purse or their family name. It is in here." He tapped a finger over his heart. "And it is in how they treat the things in their care, their animals, their land, their word." Clara understood then. She saw the truth of it in everything he did. She saw it in the way he could spend an hour patiently coaxing a frightened newborn calf to take its first milk. She saw it in the way he would always mend a fence properly, not just quickly. She saw it in the way he had given her a room of her own and asked for nothing in return. His kindness was not a strategy or a transaction. It was simply who he was. It was a fundamental part of his character, as solid and unchanging as the mountains on the horizon. He loved this life, not for what it could give him, but for what it was. And his love was a quiet, steady force he offered to the world around him, expecting absolutely nothing back. In the warmth of that realization, another piece of Clara's guarded heart quietly softened and let the light in. The Montana sky, which had been a clear, endless blue that morning, began to change by mid-afternoon. It was a subtle shift at first, a gradual paling of the sun as a thin, high haze began to veil its brightness. Elias, squinting up at it from the corral where he was checking the horse's hooves, felt a familiar prickle of unease. The air grew still and heavy, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. He finished his work quickly, his movements becoming more urgent. He came into the cabin, his brow furrowed. "Sky does not look right," he said to Clara, his voice calm but laced with a seriousness that made her look up from her sewing. "I need to ride out to the north pasture. The herd is scattered there, and if a storm comes, they will not have much shelter. I should try to push them closer to the creek bed." He pulled on a heavier coat and gathered his gloves. "I will be back before supper." He gave her a brief, reassuring nod and was gone. Clara watched from the window as he rode off, a solitary figure growing smaller and smaller against the immense landscape. The haze thickened, turning the sun into a dull silver coin. The wind, when it came, did not whisper. It arrived with a low, menacing moan that quickly escalated into a furious howl. Within minutes, the world outside the window vanished. The sky and the land merged into a swirling, blinding whiteness. The blizzard had arrived not as snow but as a furious, screaming wall of ice. She built up the fire, her hands trembling slightly. She tried to focus on her mending, but the sound of the wind was a constant, terrifying shriek. An hour passed, then another. The light outside faded from gray to an eerie early twilight. Elias was out there in that. The thought was a cold knot of fear in her stomach, colder than the ice building up on the window pane. He was strong and he knew this land. But this storm felt different. It felt angry and personal. She could not just sit. She could not wait by the fire while he might be lost and freezing. A determined calm settled over her. She moved quickly, pulling on every layer of clothing she owned. She found Elias's spare, heavy coat, the wool rough and smelling of hay and horses. It was so large it swallowed her, but it was warm. She wrapped a thick scarf around her head and face, leaving only a slit for her eyes. Harnessing the big, placid plow horse to the small wagon was a struggle. Her fingers were numb with cold and fear. But she remembered the way Elias did it, talking to the animal in a low, steady voice. The horse, sensing her urgency, stood patiently. Finally, it was done. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the cabin door open against the driving wind and led the horse and wagon out into the blinding chaos. The world was reduced to white noise and stinging ice. She could see nothing but the swirling snow and the lantern's weak glow. She guided the horse along the fence line she knew led to the north pasture, the only path she could hope to follow. The wind tore at her, trying to steal her breath and her resolve. She pushed on, calling his name, but the gale snatched the words from her lips and threw them away. Just as a true despair began to claw at her, she saw a dark shape in the whiteness. It was Elias. He was on foot, leading his limping horse, his head bowed against the storm. He was coated in a shell of ice, moving slowly, deliberately. He looked up, and the shock on his face was visible even through the mask of frost. He shouted something, but the wind stole it. He gestured wildly, trying to tell her to go back, that it was too dangerous. Clara urged the wagon closer. "Get in," she yelled, her voice raw. It took all their combined strength to help his injured horse into the wagon bed, and for Elias to haul himself up onto the seat beside her. His movements were stiff and slow with cold. She turned the wagon around. The horse, seeming to understand the mission, was now to return home and moved with renewed purpose. The journey back felt longer, the storm fighting them every step of the way. When the cabin finally emerged from the white gloom, it was the most beautiful sight Clara had ever seen. She got Elias inside, peeling off the frozen, stiff layers of his clothing. She sat him by the fire, wrapped him in blankets, and held a mug of hot broth to his lips, her own hands shaking not from cold, but from the aftershock of fear. He looked at her, his face finally beginning to regain some color, his eyes wide with a stunned gratitude. "Clara," he rasped, his voice hoarse, "you should not have come out there. It was too dangerous. You could have been lost." His concern was for her, only for her. She looked right back at him, her gaze steady now, all her former reserve burned away by the fierce need to protect him. Her answer was simple, honest, and left no room for argument. "Where else would I be?" The days that followed the blizzard were quieter, softer. A new understanding hummed in the air between Clara and Elias, as tangible as the warmth from the fireplace. They had faced the storm together, and something had shifted irrevocably. The careful distance they had maintained had been replaced by a quiet closeness. They moved around each other with a new ease, a silent communication that needed no words. A shared glance across the room could convey a whole conversation. One evening, the prairie was bathed in the deep gold light of a lingering sunset. The air was warm and carried the scent of damp earth from the melted snow. Clara sat on the porch steps watching the colors bleed across the sky. Elias came out and sat beside her, the old wood creaking softly under his weight. For a long time they just sat in a comfortable silence watching the day end. Elias took a slow, deep breath as if gathering his courage. He did not look at her, but kept his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun was dipping below the world. "Clara," he began, his voice low and gentle but filled with a profound seriousness, "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at his profile, the setting sun outlining his strong features in gold. Her heart gave a small nervous flutter. "I think I love you," he said. The words were simple, direct, and hung in the quiet air between them. They were not offered with drama or grand expectation. They were stated as a simple, quiet fact, like saying the sky was blue or the grass was green. Clara felt her breath catch in her chest, a wave of warmth rushing through her. But he was not finished. He finally turned to look at her, and his blue eyes were clear and earnest. "But I need you to know that does not change a thing." He held up a hand to stop the protest he saw forming on her lips. "My feelings for you, they are not a fence. They are not a set of rules you have to follow. They do not come with conditions." He spoke slowly, wanting her to understand every single word. "This love I have for you, it is not a trade. It is not because you bake good bread or tend the garden. It is not something you have to earn or deserve. It just is." He looked out at the land he loved so much, then back at her. "You are free, Clara. You always have been, from the very first day you arrived. That is the most important thing. My loving you does not change your freedom. You can stay here as my friend. You can leave tomorrow and start a new life somewhere else. My love for you is yours to do with as you please. It asks for nothing back. It expects nothing." Clara listened, and the truth of his words settled over her like the softest, warmest blanket. He was giving her the most incredible gift she had ever received. It was not a declaration that demanded a response. It was a confession that offered everything and asked for nothing. It was love without a single string attached. It was the absolute opposite of every conditional, demanding relationship she had ever known. In the golden light of that perfect evening, Clara Bellamy finally understood what it meant to be truly, completely, and unconditionally loved. The silence that followed Elias's words was not empty. It was full. It was filled with the chirping of crickets beginning their evening song and the soft sigh of the wind through the grass. It was filled with the overwhelming truth of what he had just given her. Clara looked at this man, this cowboy who had built a life with his own 2 hands, who spoke more with actions than with words, and who had just offered her his entire heart without asking for a single thing in return. She thought of her journey. She had stepped off the train in Sweetwater with a heart locked tight, expecting nothing but hardship and a quiet, lonely existence. She had believed she had nothing left to give the world. She had come here to hide, but Elias had not let her hide. He had given her a room of her own, a space to simply be. He had accepted her failed bread and turned it into a gift for the chickens. He had traded his coffee for a book of poetry because he saw a wish in her eyes. He had shown her that value was not in a name or a past, but in character and kindness. He had loved his land and his animals with a steady, patient heart, and without even realizing it, he had begun to love her in exactly the same way. He had given her a home, not just a house. He had given her kindness, not just shelter, and now he had given her the most precious gift of all, her complete and total freedom, wrapped in the unconditional love he offered. A feeling of profound peace settled over her. The last of the walls around her heart, the final bricks of fear and doubt, crumbled away completely, leaving her feeling light and whole for the first time in her life. She was no longer the shamed daughter of a ruined man. She was Clara. She was here. She turned on the porch step to fully face him. Her eyes, which had once been so guarded, now shone with a clarity and warmth that reflected the last of the sunset. She reached out and took his work-roughened hand in both of hers, feeling the strength and gentleness in it. "I know," she said, her voice soft, but clear as a bell in the twilight. "And my freedom has chosen you, Elias Blackwood." She squeezed his hand, her gaze steady and sure. "It chooses you. It chooses this land. It chooses this life. It chooses you every single day." She was no longer a mail-order bride fulfilling a contract. She was a woman who had been given a priceless gift and was choosing, with her whole, free heart, to give her love in return. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The promise of nothing she had come here for had become everything she could ever want. Elias looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a happiness so deep and so quiet, it seemed to radiate from his very soul. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a silent seal on the promise they had both made. Together, they sat on the porch as the stars began to pepper the vast Montana sky. Their life together, built on a foundation of unconditional love and mutual respect, was not an ending. Under the endless, watchful stars, it was a beautiful beginning. The end